Hello, my name is Scott, and in this video, I would like to talk about domestic topics in debate and some of the most effective and popular strategies on U.S. domestic topics specifically, and how the meta behind domestic topics drives a lot of the argumentation and strategic choices that debaters make throughout the course of a topic. So first, how exactly and why do domestic topics even have a meta or most efficient tactics available to begin with? And the reason behind that comes from policy debate. In both high school and college policy debate, there are topic rotations where topics can either be foreign, domestic, or mixed. So the topics, I'm not sure if this is still a thing, I think it is in college policy debate, but the topics have to go through a rotation where you are guaranteed to have a domestic topic every couple of years. So every time a domestic topic comes up in the topic rotation, there's a set of arguments that debaters traditionally default to because they're both the most effective and the most popular arguments often on topics, because that's just how debate works and how it interacts with domestic topics. I thought that this would be incredibly useful because while LD doesn't follow a specific rotation like policy debate does, the topic for September and October for 2022 about universal single-payer healthcare is definitively what I would classify as a U.S. domestic topic, and I think that this video is really important for debaters that are trying to answer the question of what exactly is the biggest strategic and argumentative question on this topic. And the biggest question that I sort of looked at when I was coming up with how I was going to go through this video is the biggest question should be, why is your agent or actor key or critical to the action of the topic? So traditionally in policy debate, this is the United States federal government, but for our LD topic, it is the United States. So when I'm approaching this topic, both from an AF perspective and a neg perspective, because they're very much blended together at a lot of parts, I want to look for, why is the U.S. key? If I'm going to defend Congress or the federal government, why is the federal government key? How am I going to answer cases that don't talk about the federal government? How am I going to defend my actor? And I think a lot of those questions inframed what I think the domestic meta looks like on domestic topics. So I portioned this out into 6 different portions that I'm going to go through. The first one is the state's counterplan. I couldn't not put the state's counterplan first. I know that a lot of people have a love-hate relationship with this argument, but the first thing you should look at is, how is my AF going to answer the state's counterplan? Or if I'm reading the state's counterplan, how is it going to solve affirmatives in the debate? I don't think you should choose your affirmative to only answer the state's counterplan, and that's the only thing that drives your strategy. I think that that's the wrong strategic choice to make. But I think that in your decision calculus on domestic topics, you definitely need to think about, how am I going to answer the state's counterplan? And that just can't be like, oh, they don't solve enough because the counterplan is going to solve your AF. You need some mechanism component either in your solvency or in your advantage that makes it so that the states have some function that makes it unable to solve your affirmative. And honestly, this is probably pretty hard, and one of the reasons why I mentioned this first, because the state's counterplan is probably going to be the most prolific argument because it's cheating. It allows the states to do a uniform action together that they've never done before in unison, and just uses fiat to dismiss all of the arguments that would traditionally be made. So while I think, this could be a thing, I would be hesitant to be like, I'm going to go all in on theory every time I hit the state's counterplan, because you're going to encounter tons of judges who just don't think that that's a thing. Think the state's counterplan's okay, especially with the time trade-offs in LD. I'm just not sure you're winning that argument. So you really need to think about how to answer the state's counterplan, because it makes the rest of the negative strategy so effective. It's not that the state's counterplan in and of itself is the argument that makes the state's counterplan the best. It's the net benefits. Every core disad on this topic is going to be avoided by the state's counterplan, in my opinion, whether it be the economy disadvantage, the federalism DA, politics, midterms, all of those type of core generic neg positions that we see on domestic topics are all going to be net benefits to the state's counterplan. So the first thing that I would think about is, how is what I'm going to say interacting with the state's counterplan on both sides of the topic? And especially for the negative, is what you're doing really that good to pass up the state's counterplan, especially given, the pretty liberal theory leanings of the debate community in 2022? Just something to think about. The second domestic topic meta that I want to go into, I think I've spent enough time on the state's counterplan, is the courts. Traditionally on domestic topics, lots of people read courts cases, courts AFs, courts DAs, both sides of the topic. The reason for reading a courts AF is pretty much what I just mentioned above. Saying courts do something is a pretty good defense mechanism of your actor, and probably answers the state's counterplan pretty well, although we'll talk about the state's courts counterplan a little later. So traditionally, the courts AF is a big thing. I will also admit that traditionally on domestic topics, I am a giant courts AF. My teams read or have read courts AFs on lots of different domestic topics. We read it on an education topic. We read it on a poverty topic, all sorts of things like that. And I will be the first one to say, I have no idea how you read a courts AF on this topic. I've yet to wrap my head around that. I don't understand how the mechanism works. I don't understand how uniqueness works. And again, I'm a hack for these arguments. I literally just don't understand how they function and can be read in a debate. And I think the same thing is true for the negative in a debate, where the negative on domestic topics traditionally reads a lot of courts arguments like the court capital DA, hollow hope, stare decisis, the clog DA, court politics, separation of powers. But I think that there's a lot of things in the status quo with different court decisions and rulings, like Roe v. Wade, that there's just a lot of articles that say stare decisis, and a lot of these concepts that we've thought about in debate just like aren't a thing, don't exist anymore. And I don't really know how a lot of affirmatives are going to deal with this on this topic, but I think that on domestic topics, traditionally, the courts has definitely been something that teams have run to. I just don't really know what that's going to look like, because a conservative court doing universal health care would be pretty interesting. The third section that is kind of like the meta behind domestic topics, or some of the things that I would think about, is what are the federal key warrants on the topic? Now, I know this is really funky because the LD topic says United States and not federal government, and there's a lot of different arguments there that, I wish it would say federal government, but that's neither here nor there. With the wording of United States, I think a lot of teams are going to want to say the federal government should do something. And traditionally, that has been backed by saying the federal government is key, or Fed key warrants. And I kind of broke this down into 5 categories that you can think about. The first way that people have traditionally made Fed key warrants on domestic topics, again, the reason you would make Fed key warrants is because the negative is going to say a bunch of counter plans, and you're going to need a defense of the federal government. The first one is executive agencies. Traditionally, debaters have done things through different executive agencies to try to either shield that agency from links, or to make it so counter plans can't deal with that agency. In the same sense, the second way that AFs can have federal key warrants is through actions that only the federal government can take. I think the best example on this healthcare topic is going to be the Hyde Amendment, which is legislation that bars funding for abortions, and how that might interact with the topic as a reason why the federal government could only do that, because obviously the states can't overrule or overturn a federal law. The third area is just different categories of people and different categories and places of things that traditionally have led to federal key warrants. I think the list of these things include the military. There are always military cases on domestic topics. I will not put it past somebody to do single payer only for the military and say hedge good. That will totally be an AF. People will say things about veterans and the Veterans Affairs, VA. There will definitely be a ton of affirmatives about Native Americans. Traditionally, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is one of those executive agencies that a lot of people will talk about. So I think that there will be a lot of affirmatives that try to deal with that, to deal with the domestic side of the topic. Prisoners is an area that people will look at, but I'm pretty sure prisoners already have universal healthcare, so that might be not a thing. Territories has always been a thing on domestic topics. I guarantee you that there will be a Puerto Rico AF on this topic, and there will also be probably things about immigrants. And I'm just not saying this is like I'm trying to give a topic lecture. These are things that I would look at for domestic areas for you to gain ground that only that thing or agency or actor can be able to solve for, because that's going to be able to make you defend yourself versus counterplans in the debate. The fourth area for federal key warrants, I'm just going to mention because I already went over this, is the courts. And the last one is not an area, but more so an advantage. So traditionally on domestic topics, teams have read advantage areas that are hard for not the federal government to capture. Things I can think about, the biggest one is hedge. Traditionally, teams who don't want to answer the state's counterplan say hedge good, and then they say the states can't do hedge. Now, I know that there's a bunch of different arguments there, and, you can devolve states' rights to doing that. Probably the state's counterplan is not legit, in my opinion, but, these are things that are up for debate. Other areas where Fed key advantage areas that you could read: separation of powers, plenary powers, things that deal with the courts, like international law is going to be really hard for states to do. I don't know how you say, actually, you could say international law on this topic, but there's tons of different advantage areas that list is not exclusive to, that traditionally teams have also gone to try to make it so those counter plans don't solve them as much. The last three areas I'm going to try to breeze through here. The fourth component to domestic topics that I think that you should think about is actor counterplans. Actor counterplans always come about on domestic topics. The Congress counterplan, the courts counterplan, the XO counterplan, ask them in cross-ex which one they are, read A-spec, and then read the other one. If the AF says XO, you say courts. If they say courts, you say Congress. It's a really easy neg strategy to use, especially when federalism, the econ DA, midterms, the politics disads are all different things that you could say on this topic as agent actor type counterplans. Going back to the courts for a second, always on these topics, once courts get popularized, different courts counterplans come in, whether it's the state courts counterplan, the 9-0 counterplan, veto Cheeto. If Congress is going to do it, you have these same type of counterplans where you have a non-delegation with the executive branch, you have signing statements, all of these different types of actor-specific and process actor-specific counterplans are definitely things that teams default to as generics, especially in the beginning of the topic, that you should think about when you're trying to break down what the meta of domestic topics is. Fifth component of domestic topics is impact turns. Domestic topics, always giant. Impact turn topics, not going to spend a lot of time here, but I expect hedge bad, DDev, recession good, all democracy bad, all of that type of stuff is normally very, very, very popular on domestic topics because almost every affirmative has it, and it's pretty easy to read an advantage counterplan for one advantage and impact turn the other, and those are pretty easy debates that lots of judges, including myself, love to judge and give high speaker points in. So, impact turns generally, a thing on most topics, but I think because of the limited advantage areas, lots of people are going to read cost advantages or access advantages, but counterplans are going to solve those. The reason these types of scenarios or advantage areas for impact turns are important is teams are going to have to read those advantages in order to stave off counterplans in the debate. So I think that investing some time in impact turns is definitely a part of the domestic meta. The last portion of this that I want to briefly talk about is just domestic topics are great for basic critiques. Neo-lib, set call, all of your legal critiques, all of these domestic topics are core for you saying these type of critical arguments that I think that anybody who wants to say those things, I think that even this specific domestic topic is really good for those things. So hopefully you found this intro on the domestic topics and what people have traditionally read on them in the past pretty helpful. I will have some more things to come on states counterplan theory, midterms, all sorts of things like that. But hopefully you found this useful, and I will see you next time. Bye.